The poem of Era and Ishum, a Babylonian poet's view of war. Introduction.
The history of war begins in ancient Iraq. The earliest reported conflict in human history was fought by neighboring city-states, Lagash and Ummah, in the mid-3rd millennium BC. The early course of the war is reported by Enmetena, ruler of Lagash, in a Sumerian cuneiform inscription preserved on clay objects, a cone, a cylinder, 2 votive jars, that commemorate his restoration of a religious building that had been damaged in the war. The text records a succession of aggressive acts and retaliations. The prose is bald and matter-of-fact. The following passage is typical. It recounts the invasion of Lagash's territory by Urluma of Ummah and his allies during the time of Enmetena's father in Anatum, and their repulse by forces commanded by his son. He enlisted troops from all countries and crossed over the boundary ditch of the god Ningirsu, i.e. of Lagash. Anatum, ruler of Lagash, joined battle with him at close quarters in Wheatfield, land belonging to the god Ningirsu, i.e. to Lagash. Enmetena, Anatum's beloved child, defeated him. Urluma ran away but was killed in Ummah. He abandoned his chariotry, 60 teams strong, at the bank of the Luma Girnunta Canal. The bones of their personnel were left scattered all over the plain. Enmetena heaped up burial mounds for them in 5 different places. This and other accounts of the war from Lagash are already vivid in detail, but do not make for impartial history writing. Ummah is always the unjust aggressor, and Lagash always triumphs after initial defeat. Nevertheless, the detail encourages a belief that the sequence of events reported in the narrative of this and other inscriptions from Lagash is chronologically accurate, even if tendentious. On this basis, modern scholars have confidently written histories of the conflict. The war was fought over the rich arable land that lay between the 2 city-states. The territories of Lagash and Ummah straddled what is now the road north from Nasiriyah to Kut al-Amara in southern Iraq. The road runs parallel to the Shat al-Gharaf, also known as the Shat al-Hahai, a watercourse that brings water from the Tigris to the country north of Nasiriyah. In antiquity, an ancestor of the same watercourse was considered part of the Tigris itself and acknowledged as the source of Lagash's prosperity, for it provided water to irrigate the land and produce the enormous yields of barley that were typical of the whole country and, much later, astonished Herodotus. One may reflect with melancholy that this fertile plain is now largely a barren waste, and that the road through it not long ago provided an easy route for tanks going into battle in the invasion of Iraq. Like many conflicts over natural resources, the war between Lagash and Ummah was no short affair, for the inscriptions of Enmetena and others tell that it flared up during the reigns of successive rulers across several generations. Victory eventually fell to Ummah, whose ruler Luagal-Zagesi sacked Lagash, destroyed its sanctuaries, and brought a temporary end to its existence as an independent state. Thus, the people of Iraq, ancient and modern, have had the misfortune to witness war at both extremes of human history. War has returned to them on many occasions during the interval of 4,500 years that elapsed between Enmetena and Saddam Hussein. This essay considers a long Akkadian composition of the 1st millennium BC, in which a Babylonian poet reflects on his own experience of war in the land that is now Iraq. The composition is usually called the poem of Era and Ishum. In order to understand it better, it is apt first to examine other literary responses to war that survive in the extant poetry and prose of ancient Mesopotamia. These responses occur in texts composed in the 2 literary languages of Babylonia, Sumerian, mostly older, and Akkadian, mostly later.
Heroic war in Babylonian literature.
There is no shortage of literary description of war in ancient Mesopotamia. The Akkadian annals of Assyrian kings especially are punctuated by accounts of military campaigns. Some of these are written in highly literary language. A fine example is the composition known as Sargon's 8th Campaign, in reality a campaign report by an Assyrian king, Sharuken II. There, he debriefs the national god Assur on the outcome of a long and difficult campaign conducted in the Zagros Mountains of Iraq and Iran, present-day Kurdistan, in 714 BC. Mayer, 1983, Foster, 2005. The report is notable for unusual and original descriptions of the terrain crossed by the Assyrian army. The major battle scene also deploys literary language but is comparatively brief. A more extended description of battle from ancient Mesopotamia occurs in the account of the 8th campaign of Sargon's son and successor on the throne of Assyria, Sennacherib, biblical Sennacherib, 704 to 681 BC. This campaign was fought against Elam, modern Khuzestan, and its Babylonian allies in 691 BC, and culminated in a great battle at Halule, a town on the Tigris, perhaps somewhere near modern Samarra. By command of the great Lord Asser, my lord, I blasted against the enemy to front and side like the onslaught of a violent tempest. With the weapons of my lord Asser and the fierce onslaught of my battle, I turned their advance and put them into retreat. With arrows and darts, I pierced the enemy's troops and perforated their entire bodies like pincushion. Humbanandasa, the marshal of the king of Elam, a well-trusted fellow who commanded his army, his main hope, along with his officers, whose belts were equipped with gold daggers and arms girt with sling bands of ruddy gold. I butchered them forthwith like fattened steers tethered by rope, and brought about their demise. I slit their throats like sheep. I sliced through their precious necks as through thread. I made their blood flow over the broad earth like a flood cresting in the rainy season. The thoroughbred stallions harnessed to my vehicle plunged at a gallop into deep pools of their blood as into a river. The wheels of my battle chariot, which lays low, wicked, and evil, were awash with blood and gore. I filled the plain like grass with the corpses of their warriors. I cut off their mustaches and robbed them of dignity. Like the fruit of a ripe cucumber, I cut off their hands and took from their arms the sling bands of pure gold and silver. With sharp swords I severed their belts. I robbed them of the daggers of gold and silver at their waists. Amun-Menanu, the king of Elam, along with the king of Babylon and sheiks of Chaldea who accompanied him, terror of my battle, overwhelmed their persons like a specter. They abandoned their tents and to save their lives escaped by trampling over the corpses of their soldiers, their hearts pounding like a hunted pigeon chicks. Scalding their chariots with urine, they fouled them with excrement. I commanded my chariotry to chase after them, in order to cut down those running for their lives wherever they could catch up with them. We know from the Babylonian Chronicle, a less partial source, that the outcome of this battle, for all Sennacherib's claims of a rout, was actually an Assyrian reverse. Leaving aside the historical context and turning to literary issues, the passage is notable for its bombastic style and rhetorical ambition, conveyed especially in its choice of vocabulary and relentless but often mundane imagery. This can be seen in translation. So too can the literary allusions that give the account a mythical dimension by recalling the primeval battle of the gods that gave order to the cosmos. Weisert, 1997. Less visible is a syntactical feature in which the verb of some clauses is placed in penultimate position. In normal Akkadian, verbs fall at the end of the clause. In prose, unlike in poetry, the penultimate placing of a verb in its clause does not occur where the conjunctive enclitic particle, ma, binds the clause to what follows. Its function thus seems to be pausal. Penultimate placing of the verb is a standard feature of elevated Akkadian prose, going back to the 3rd millennium, George, 2007, A41. It marks the present passage, and indeed Sennacherib's inscription as a whole, as a deliberately literary artifact. As a literary artifact, a piece of writing can exhibit more than just elevated language and special syntax. It can also display a particular tone. In this case, the tone is heroic. The heroic style is not only achieved by language, it is also achieved by the ideas that the language conveys. This is important for the present purpose. The idea expressed here is that the battlefield is a place of carnage, but the carnage is glorious. The gory details, so carefully composed, redound to the glory of the king, giving the impression of an heroic figure charging through the field in his chariot, impervious to danger, and laying low the enemy on all sides. The text speaks of the ideal kingly exploit, rather than reality, for Sennacherib was probably at home in his palace when the battle was fought. This gave the composer all the more leeway to present an heroic embellishment of the battle rather than a purely factual description. The heroic view of war, articulated in Sennacherib's annals and other royal inscriptions, is characteristic of much ancient writing on war, not least in Mesopotamia. It can be explored by a brief exposition of one particular trope, the idea that war is a festival. This idea is typical of poets of ancient Mesopotamia and firmly entrenched in their repertory. The exact word festival occurs in this context in two compositions of the early second millennium. The Sumerian narrative poem Lugali elaborates a myth in which a young warrior god defeats a demonic mountain that threatens order. My lord, do not go forth to a combat so giant. Do not raise your arm where weapons clash in the festival of young men, the dance of Inanna. My lord, do not go rushing to a battle so serious. Keep your feet fixed here. O Ninurta, on the mountain there lurks in wait for you Asag. The motif of the cautious servant who advises against a fight occurs elsewhere in Mesopotamian literature, notably in the Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh, where the hero's companion Enkidu cautions him against attacking the monster Humbaba in the mountain of the cedar forest. An old Babylonian version of this Akkadian poem reads thus: I knew him, my friend, in the uplands, when I roamed here and there with the herd. All about for 60 leagues the forest's a wilderness, who is there would venture inside it? Huwawa's roar is the deluge, his mouth is fire, his breath is death. Why desire to take this action? Huwawa's ambush is a battle unwinnable. The two passages, Sumerian and Akkadian, elaborate the exact same theme in the very similar circumstances, and are an example of the common ideas that could inform literary creativity in both languages. Apart from the motif of the cautious servant, this passage of Babylonian Gilgamesh shares with Lugale the image of the monstrous opponent lurking ready to surprise the hero in unfamiliar territory. But it does not express the heroic idea that battle is a festival. Sumerian Izenin, Lugale.
The poem of Era and Ishum.
Elsewhere in Gilgamesh, however, the idea is explicit. Enkidu's early misgivings are set aside when it becomes clear that his king will go to the Cedar Mountain come what may. On the journey to the forest, Gilgamesh has a series of nightmares, and Enkidu's task is to give them a reassuring explanation. Each explanation is a prophecy of perilous combat leading to ultimate success. The following lines explain a nightmare in which Gilgamesh is pinned down by a mountain avalanche, but then extricated. Now this Huwawa whom we go against, is he not the mountain? He is different in every way. You and he will come face to face, and you will do something unique. The right of a warrior, the task of a man. He'll make his fury rage against you. He'll wrap his terror tight around your legs. The context in which the poet inserts the line, Parum sa mutim supirti zikari, is clear enough. Gilgamesh will encounter his monstrous enemy and combat will ensue. Unique because never before experienced in the history of heroism, a mortal king will fight a god. The line that occupies us here expresses the idea of battle through metonyms, the right of a warrior, the task of a man. Combat is a masculine activity, but more than that, it is a divinely ordained duty, parum. The word parum in the previous passage is close in meaning to festival, and there takes the same function. Other Old Babylonian compositions in Akkadian use isinumen, festival, a loan word from Sumerian, azin, the word encountered already in Lugale 136. In Lugale, battle was not only a festival, but also the dance of Inanna. Inanna was the Sumerian name for the ancient Mesopotamian goddess of war and sex. According to the poet of one Sumerian hymn in her honor, war was an expression of her joy, the very music of her being. With joyous heart, she brings a song of death to the field of battle, and while her heart performs the song, she soaks their weapons in blood and gore. The Babylonians called this goddess Ishtar. Her nature as a goddess of sex has been much explored, but there have been fewer studies of the textual evidence for her as war goddess. Recently, Zolnay 2010. The old Babylonian poem of Agushaya Ulagi sees Ishtar in her aspect as divine patron of warfare, among others, and asserts once more that Isinsa Tamawaru, her festival, is battle. Text Groneberg 1997, 76, 6-7 plus 6-7, 11. The metaphor is part of the repertoire in poems that describe battle, and at least two more occurrences of it survive in Akkadian poetry. One is also Old Babylonian, in a heroic poem about the inimitable conquests of a legendary 3rd millennium king, Sargon of Akkad. In a passage that celebrates the qualities of a warrior, the poet looks forward to battle on the morrow. When Isinum Samut Inepus, the festival of men will be enacted. Text Westenholz 1997-62, I-19. A long narrative poem about the Assyrian king Tukulti Ninurta II's conquest of Babylonia employs the trope twice. First, the Assyrian looks forward to battle as an occasion when divine justice will be meted out to his untrustworthy adversary, King Kashtiliash of Babylon, and hopes that in a Isin Tamo Airi Satu Etig Mamdi Aela, he who broke his vow, the Babylonian enemy shall not survive the festival of combat. Cook T. 1981-99, Ernishib, text 1981-99, Vershit Jah, text 1981-99, shall be a Jehovah, a battle duly won, and the coward Kashtiliash put to flight. The Assyrian warriors urge their king to have them attack the Babylonian army and march on Babylon, reflecting how, since the beginning of Tukulti Ninurta's reign, they have enjoyed nothing but warfare, and Kablu u Ipiru Isananid Naidni, combat and fighting are a festival and a joy to us. Text Kook 1981, 1.6 v11. The heroic vision of war is a young man's idea. First-hand experience of battle often leads to a revision of that idea. General William Sherman, 182018-9-1111, knew much of war, for he rose to command Union forces in the American Civil War, and thereafter led the U.S. Army in the Indian War, so 1870 In 1880, he gave an impromptu address to a large crowd of veteran soldiers and civilians in Columbus, Ohio, and made the much-quoted observation, "There is many a boy here today who looks on war as all glory, but boys, it is all hell." These simple words of an old soldier neatly assert the divide between the juvenile idealism of the heroic view of war and the realism of those who have been through it. The same divide exists in literature, between the heroic idea of war, documented above for Babylonia, and a very different response. To the latter we now turn.
Non-heroic war in Babylonia, the poem of Era and Isum.
The Babylonian poem of Era and Ishum, like many literary compositions in Akkadian, is currently in the process of reconstruction. It was last subject to a critical edition 40 years ago, Cagney 1969, but a more up-to-date reconstruction informs the most recent English translation, Foster 2005, 1189, and 11. Much of it is now extant, but further discoveries of text are needed in order to gain complete knowledge of it. For the moment, we have the text in 5 sections, tablets of unequal length, yielding a total of nearly 700 lines of poetry. The middle of the poem is especially fragmentary, tablets 2 to 14, but the poem was probably about 800 lines when complete. The poem's date of composition is disputed. The oldest manuscripts come from the Royal Library of Nineveh, mid-7th century BC, but scholars have judged variously from the poem's content that it is anything from 400 to 100 years older than that. Machen 1983, 221, Beolu 2000, 2529, From 210-7. The content is mainly a succession of long speeches through which is described the destruction of Babylonian cities in a combination of civil war and foreign invasion. The historical background is a long period of weak rule in Babylonia, punctuated by violent disorder, which began with the Aramean incursions of the 11th century and continued to the 8th century. For much of this period, very little is known of Babylonian history, and only slightly more of Assyrian. The poem is formally kin to the traditional Babylonian mythological narrative poetry, often called epic, as in the creation epic, Talon 2005, Lambert 2008, 3759, and the Epic of Gilgamesh, George 2003, but represents a radical departure from it in style. Foster 2007, 106-109. Its form is much less the customary narrative and much more extended rhetorical monologue. The speeches serve to tell the story and thus function as narrative. In this respect, it recalls the old Sumerian genre of city laments, see Spurl in this volume. Like the city laments, its topic is war among humans, and so it bears comparison with the Iliad. Its protagonists, even more than the Iliads, are gods. Hera, god of war, his minister, Ishum, and Marduk, king of the gods. There are no named human characters at all, only a milling mass in the background, like the extras in a Hollywood blockbuster. I have previously observed that, in Fowler's typology of the development of epic, the poem of Hera and Ishum belongs in the tertiary stage, for it serves as an allegorical reinterpretation of the old myth in which gods make war on mankind. George 2007 B. 56. Its generic kinship with the older Babylonian epics should alert us to the possibility that, like some of them, especially the Epic of Gilgamesh, the poem of Hera and Ishum is a vehicle for reflection on the human condition. The Epic of Gilgamesh is, in its last version, partly a meditation on the fact of death and the meaning of life. The creation epic gives an answer to questions about mankind's origin and place in the great order of things. It seems that in the Babylonian literary system, philosophical and religious discourse concerned with existential problems was embedded not only in what is often called wisdom literature, but also in mythological narrative poetry. For all its divine cast of characters, the poem of Hera and Ishum is nevertheless a composition that grasps a very human problem, the problem of war, and attempts to understand it. It has long been recognized that, for all that elsewhere in ancient Mesopotamian sources Hera is a god of plague, in the poem of Hera and Ishum, he is a warrior who longs only to practice his métier, e.g. Botero, 1978, 138-39. His métier is nowhere more fully described than in this poem, where the accounts of war and its consequences are unrelenting and graphic. The absence of glory makes it clear that the poem is a forceful repudiation of war. Benjamin Foster has commented of the poem that its denunciations of violence are so eloquent and lengthy that the poem can scarcely be read as anything but a condemnation of civil strife as a violation of the cosmic order. Foster, 2007-67. In my view, the condemnation is not restricted to civil war. In rejecting the era of the poem as an epic hero, Luigi Cagni rightly observed that he represents the hellish aspect of war, Cagni 1977-9, and found him not so much a character as an allegorical mask. It is legitimate to go further and assert that in this poem Hera is a divine personification of war in general, and that the poem's principal statement is of war's incomparable horror and irresistible force. The poem's plot can be summarized briefly, but I shall dwell a while on the opening passage, whose formal construction is tricky to parse, but which contains a crucial message. As understood here, it begins with a 5-line invocation to Hera's minister Ishum in his name Hindursanga, who is eulogized as king of the earth and creator of all things, king of all habitations, creator of the world, regents, O Hindursanga, foremost son of Enlil, who bears an august staff, herdsman of the black-headed race, shepherd of mankind, O Ishum, renowned butcher whose hands are suited to bear fierce weapons, who, flashing his terrible battle axe, makes even Hera, most warlike of gods, quake in his dwelling. We can note at once something important about the poem's form. In much Babylonian poetry, as well as other ancient Near Eastern poetry, lines conventionally coincide with syntax, so that a pause occurs at the end of the line, and lines combine by sense in pairs, so that a longer pause attends the end of the even line. Thus, a poem proceeds couplet by couplet. Often couplets themselves are paired to form 4-line stanzas, but identifying these can sometimes be problematic and a subjective exercise. The formal construction of this poetry has the advantage of flagging up the boundaries between units of sense and marking the extent of topics. The first 4 lines of Hera and Ishum constitute a 4-line stanza of 2 balanced couplets, 1, 2, 3, 4, in each of which the second line is headed by one of the addressee's names. The topic of the first couplet is Ishum's cosmic status. He is invoked as ruler of the world and son of the supreme deity. The second couplet dwells on his functions as first pastor, then warrior. The application of grand cosmic epithets to Ishum, the lowly minister of Hera, has disturbed many scholars, who have sought to place another god's name in the lacuna at the end of L 1.8. This is unnecessary because, as we shall see later, the poem has good reason in the particular context of war to exalt Ishum above all others. Line 5 presents a departure in form because although it starts a new couplet, it is syntactically dependent on line 4. It serves to introduce Era, who is the topic of the next line, as we shall see. The couplet, line 5-6, is thus a hinge between Ishum, the addressee, and Era, the protagonist. The disjunctive syntax, which places a sentence final pause in between the two lines, results in an irregular couplet, after which the text again proceeds in regular couplets, LL, 7-8, 9-10, 11-12, etc. Perhaps this violence to the poem's third couplet is a deliberate device to give force to the shift in topic, from Ishum to Era. The burden of Era is afraid of Ishum, restates the poet's very exalted view of Ishum. The poet follows the 5-line invocation by showing Ishum and the audience a scene in which Ishum's master, lying in bed, ponders the pros and cons of going to war. The arguments are articulated as an internal dialogue between Era's mind, Libu, literally heart, and his physical self. The heart wants to make war, and to that effect addresses in turn Era's weapons, the 7, his vizier Ishum, and finally Era himself, in particular urging Ishum, as Era's torch or firebrand, his name means fire, to show the others the way. The latter detail clearly alludes to the military tactic of surprise attack before dawn, and fixes the scene at night. Era's desired of him the waging of war. It talked to his weapons, smear yourselves with lethal poison, and to the 7, peerless warriors, strap on your weapons. It spoke to you, Ishum, I would go forth to the battlefield. You are the firebrand, they watch your light. You are the vanguard, the gods. You are the sword that slaughters the enemy. O Era, arise, how your mood will be bright, your heart joyous when laying the land low. Era's body is too sleepy to obey his mind, and he chooses to stay in bed. War is not so easily started. The poet then resumes his address to Ishum, now in his name as the torch-bearing night watchman Enkidudu. Era's arms were exhausted, like a man without sleep. Said he to his heart, should I rise or lie asleep? He spoke to his weapons, go stand in your alcove. To the 7, peerless warriors, return to your places. Until you Ishum yourself rouse him, he lies in his bedchamber sleeping, making love with Mami, his wife. O Lord Enkidudu, who goes about at night, guiding the nobleman, who guides man and woman in safety, shining a light bright as day. The key to understanding this opening passage of 22 lines is the identification of who is speaking and where they stop. Because cuneiform writing lacks punctuation, translators of the passage have been uncertain where to place the quotation marks. In addition, the passage's formal construction has not always survived translation clearly, because it is not generally recognized that the little narrative of Era in bed continues the poet's address to Ishum. In my view, the correct interpretation has been clearly demonstrated by Gerfried Müller, 1995, also 1994, 783 N, 7a. But his important and convincing study of the passage has not achieved the attention it merits. It is tacitly rejected by Walter Farber's treatment of this passage, 2008, and overlooked completely by Frauke Weierschauser's discussion of it in her study of Ishum, 2010, 361. For this reader, these most recent attempts to interpret the passage make for a step back into the hermeneutic mire that characterized discussion of it before Muller's breakthrough. Lest it be forgotten, Muller's reading demands restating. Ishum, as the addressee of the invocation, is the second person of Lel 9 and 19. The third-person subject of the verbs of speech in Lel 7 and 9 cannot therefore be Ishum, but must be Era's heart. It speaks to Era and is then answered by him. The heart addresses one couplet to the weapons, Era 18, to one to Era himself, 13-14. Hara's reply to his heart occupies one couplet, 15-16, and his orders to the weapons a further couplet, 17-18. He does not speak to Ishum at this point. The focus returns to Ishum, however, with a 4-line stanza that reprises the poet's invocation, 1922. As punctuated here, the opening 22 lines of the poem thus form 11 couplets that display very careful composition as a unit. It has already been observed that the two invocations to Ishum, I-15-1922, act as a frame, or inclusio, Machinist 1983-223. What emerges more clearly is that the material so framed is the poet's revelation to him, Ishum, of a dialogue going on not between Ishum and his master, but solely in Era's mind, 6:18. The important point is that it is not, after all, Ishum who urges Era to combat Pace Machinus. The identification of the second person of 9 and 19 as Ishum shows, nevertheless, that Ishum has the capability of rousing Era to action and thus initiating warfare, 19 Tadakusu, even if he does not do it on this occasion. The poem now turns its attention from Ishum to Era's weapons, the Seven. It first describes their origin, created by the sky god Anu, and their function, which is to destroy human and animal life when Era's tolerance of such things is exhausted, I-23 E444. The only figure who stands between the Seven and action is not Era, but Ishum. I-27 Isum deltuma adil panusum. Ishum is a door bolted before them. Ishum is thereby again identified as an initiator of violence, but the image is a double-edged sword, for doors close as well as open. Ishum, as we shall see, is a force of moderation. He can terminate warfare as well as start it. The poem returns to the present and the first true line of narrative which describes the weapon's fury at Era's rejection of them. From their corner they harangue him with a long speech which goads him into action, I-4591. Part of the speech is a paean to the virtues of a soldier's life. The passage, like the whole speech, is firmly cast in the heroic mold and contains a further instance of the war is a festival motif introduced above. Shall we eat women's bread like those who do not go on campaign? Shall we tremble with fear like those untried in battle? For men to go on campaign is like a festival, but he who stays in town can never eat enough, not even as ruler. He is vilified by his people, his standing diminished. How can he measure up to a veteran soldier? However sturdy a civilian's muscles, how can he wax strong as a veteran soldier? The luxury bread of town cannot compare with a loaf baked in ashes. Sweet pale ale cannot compare with water from a leather bottle. A palace on a terrace cannot compare with a bivouac in the open. O valiant Era, go forth on campaign and rattle your weapons. The speech eventually turns to the reasons for the weapon's desire for action. These are two familiar motivations. The first is that the human and animal population has grown so much that the economy is in danger, I-79-86. War is thus justified, as in Greek literature, West 1997, 481, as a mechanism for controlling the numbers who compete for the planet's resources. The second motivation is that the weapons are going rusty, and we who once knew mountain passes have forgotten every route. Cobwebs are spun on our battle kit. Our sweet bows turned rebel, too stiff for our strength. Our sharp arrow's tip is blunt. Our daggers gone rusty for lack of bloodshed. This poet understood that, among the many causes of war, the desire of generals to test their men and equipment is a potent factor. As a military man, Era is roused by these words and proposes to go on campaign after all, I-92-99. Ishum asks why he plots war against mankind, but Era silences him with a paean of self-praise, I-100-13. The reason he gives for war is this. No god has recently brought conflict to the world, so men have lost their respect for the divine powers, and in particular do not fear Era himself. They hold me in contempt, he says, not once but over and again, I-120, 3D15, 113. This is, again, a true insight. A generation that has not known war is less likely to fear it. Terror of war is learned most surely through experience. Era intends to regain the respect he has lost. Era goes to Babylon to visit Marduk, the king of the gods, in his temple Esengil. Marduk is characterized as distinctly past his prime. The purpose of Era's visit seems to be to encourage Marduk to leave Babylon on the pretext that his holy statue needs refurbishing, for then the world would be ungoverned and chaos could prevail. Marduk consents to Era's plan, but only when Era promises to maintain order in his absence. When Marduk returns, Era takes offense, either at some slight or because he has been tricked out of the opportunity to use his power. He delivers a long monologue in which he vows to give Marduk and the other senior gods cause to remember him, and again brags of his warlike prowess and destructive power. The effect of Era's anger is immediate bloodshed and anarchy, at least in the city of Nippur, where the local god Enlil abandons his dwelling. This is told in a report of Isham to Era, as if in remonstration with his master. Here Isham is a force for restraint. The violence in Nippur is not the result of Marduk leaving his cosmic station a second time. Rather, it seems that his earlier absence from his temple has produced an instability in the cosmos, which has repercussions even after he reoccupied it. It is now Isham's turn to vaunt Era's power. He does so in the most lofty of terms. O valiant Era, you grasp heaven's halter. You master the entire world, you rule the people. You roil the very ocean, master even the mountain. You herd mankind, you drive the livestock. Heaven's at your disposal, hell's in your hands. You have charge of Babylon, give orders to Esengil. You're master of all the cosmic powers, even the gods are in terror of you. Is there warfare without you? Here Isham voices the poet's view that there is no force on earth, nor in the entire universe, that can master Era, who eclipses even the king of the gods in Babylon. Isham's speech continues with a vivid description of the chaos that Era has wrought. What he describes is nothing less than political events in Babylonia, its invasion by an enemy army and the subsequent civil war. There is nothing heroic about the fighting. The description is notable for brutality. You altered your divine being and became like a man. You strapped on your weapons and entered the city. Inside Babylon, you spoke subversively, as if to take over the town. Like reeds in a marsh having no leader, the men of Babylon all gathered around you. The soldiers saw you and strapped on their weapons. Babylon's governor, the city's protector, was taken with fury. He commanded his troops to loot as if looting a foe, inciting the generals to acts of wickedness. You, my man, whom I send to this city, respect no god and fear no man. Do young and old to death just the same, and spare not even any babe unweaned. The city is so polluted by bloodshed that Marduk cannot any longer abide in his temple, and amid bitter lament leaves his station at the center of the cosmos. Era now has the whole world at his mercy. One further excerpt will give an idea of the poem's preoccupation with the effects of his war. Isham is quoting Era, him who had a son and said, "This is my son. Thus I have raised him, so he will return my favor. I shall do the son to death, and his father shall bury him. Then I shall do the father to death, and he shall have none to bury him. Him who built a house and said, 'This is my home.' Thus I have built it so I may rest inside it. When fate has carried me off, I shall sleep within. Him I shall do to death, and his home make a ruin. Then even as a ruin, I'll give it to a stranger." This passage expresses the denial, through Era's violence, of the most basic human aspiration, to leave behind a lasting family. In a Babylonian household, where ancestors were often buried beneath the floor, it was a son's duty to lead commemorative rites for his family's ghosts. He thus ensured both the ancestors' comfort after death and the survival of the family as a social unit. The premature death of a son and the destruction of the home were considered a terrible violation of the natural order. The passage states that war made this fear a reality for many. The emphasis of these two passages of Isham's speech just quoted, and of the speech as a whole, is on the voracity of the war god and the indiscriminate violence he brings. The poem does not celebrate Era's violence as glorious. It concentrates on the plight of the victims. It does so not because the manner of their deaths redounds to a victor's glory, as in Sennacherib's campaign report quoted above, but to demonstrate the horrors of warfare as suffered by those caught up in it. Similarly, the poetry of Wilfred Owen, 189311918, and others that served in the trenches of Flanders, gassed, maimed, and dismembered. The readers of Owen's poems and of Era and Isham identify with the anonymous and numberless victims of war. defenseless in the face of war's ferocity. Though from his throat the life tide leaps, there was no threat upon his lips. It is this empathy with the victim that, above all, makes the mood non-heroic. Next, Era vows to destroy the seat of cosmic government so that all voices of moderation are silenced. I will attack the seat of the king of the gods so no voice of reason will survive. And the effect of Era's ambition then becomes yet more terrible as he launches on the world a conflict that will bring all countries to civil war. Sealander must not spare Sealander, nor Subartan, nor Assyrian, nor Elamite, nor Kassite, nor Sutian, nor Gutian, nor Laluban, nor nation, nor city, nor house, nor man, nor brother, but they shall slay each other. Only then will Era permit the carnage to cease, when a new ruler will arise in Babylonia. IV 136. To facilitate this new order, Era allows Ishum to bring an end to the conflict, which he does by making war on Mount Sharshar, formerly read Hihi. This place was the symbolic homeland of the nomadic peoples whose uprising had brought chaos and civil war to Babylonia, so Ishum's campaign is a war not of aggression, but of self-defense. His mission, with its clearly demarcated goal, is very different from Era's indiscriminate rampage. It is told in briefest style and without blood. Ishum set out for the mountain Sharshar, the 7 peerless warriors following behind him. At the mountain Sharshar, the warrior arrived. He raised his hand and destroyed the mountain. The mountain Sharshar he turned into a void. He felled the trees of the forest of cedar. The woodland looked as if traversed by the deluge. He took control of the towns and made them desert. He destroyed the uplands and slew their flocks. He roiled the oceans and wiped out their produce. He laid waste reed beds and woodlands and burned them like fire. He cursed the livestock and turned them to dust. Ishum's campaign is devoid of horror. It is without explicit human casualties aside from the impersonal towns, and adopts instead the language of mythology, where gods do battle with mountains, seas, and forces of nature. And with this bloodless passage, the war is over. As the gods look on in horror at Era returning from the field, this is what he says to them. Be silent, all of you, and learn what I say. Have no doubt, 13, I intended evil when earlier I did wrong. I was in a rage to lay low the people. Like a hireling shepherd, I'll send the bellwether up from the pen, 14. Like one who's never planted an orchard, I'll not hesitate to cut it down. Like one who pillages the land, I'll kill upright and wicked without discrimination. You cannot snatch a corpse from a ravening lion. And where one is in a rage, another cannot counsel. The gist of this passage is that it is the very nature of Era, who nurtures nothing, to destroy without thought, and his excuse is that when he is angry, that no one can control him. The gods, as well as men, have seen for themselves the full extent of Era's power and witnessed the blind arbitrariness of his indiscriminate deeds. Era then commends the role of Ishum, who brought the war to an end. Without Ishum, my vanguard, what now would exist? Where your provisioner, where your high priests? Where your food offerings, you would smell no incense. Ishum opened his mouth to speak, saying a word to the hero, Era. O hero, be silent and listen to what I say. Have no doubt, be calm and we shall stand at your service. 16. At the time of your fury, who could withstand you? Era thereby acknowledges that Ishum saved the world from complete destruction, so that once again a king might perform the task traditionally his, to look after the care and feeding of the gods in their temples. Ishum, in turn, acknowledges on behalf of all that there is no power in the universe to match Era when roused. Recognition of this truth, self-evident from the events reported in tablets 3 and 4, pleases Era. At last he is content, basking in the god's acknowledgement of the supremacy of his power. He commands that the country shall thrive in a period of new prosperity under the rule of a king in Babylon, B25 through 38. Era gives to Ishum the tasks of perpetuating Ishum's victory over the enemies of Babylon. Thus it is Ishum who will ensure that the Babylonians enjoy a future of order and prosperity. The weakest Babylonian shall fell the strongest Sutian. One shall lead 7 captive like sheep. You shall turn his towns into ruins, his mountain into wastes. You shall bring their weighty plunder back to Babylon. You shall reconcile to their homes the gods of the land who were angry. You shall send down to the land the gods of livestock and grain. You shall make uplands produce their plenty, the sea its yield. You shall make bare crops, the meadows laid waste. The poem's conclusion follows. It begins with a summary of what the poem has been about and how it was transmitted to the poet. The first line and a half, however, complete Era's instruction to Ishum. Have the provisioner of Asangal and Babylon rule 19 them, the governors of all habitations, var of each and every city, for years without number. 20. The praise of the great Lord. Nergal equals Era and hero Ishum. How Era went into a rage and set out to lay the lands low and destroy their people, but his counselor Ishum calmed him, so sparing a remnant. The compiler of its text was Kabdi Ilaini Marduk, son of De Ebibu. He, Ishum, revealed it to him in a nocturnal vision, and just as he, Paya, declaimed it while wakeful. So he left nothing out, he added to it not a single line. This passage is much cited as a rare example of the attribution of a Babylonian literary composition to an author, E.G. Foster, 1991. The statement that Kabdi Ilaini Marduk received the poem in a dream is perhaps not a literary conceit, for it can readily be compared with Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Kubla Khan, 1798. Coleridge wrote that the poem came to him in sleep as a text of many hundreds of lines, but he had only managed to write out the beginning when interrupted by a visitor. In Coleridge, 1967, 295, 296. To return to the theme of war, at the beginning of the poem, Ishum was invoked as a catalyst for war, but here at the end, in the passage just quoted, the poet identifies him as Era's appeaser and the initiator of peace. A very revealing earlier line, repeated twice by Era, makes clear in the briefest possible form of words that Ishum has both functions. I-99//3C27. Ye-a, elik ma loria, elik ma aor. Pares tamadore iac. This makes no sense in spatial terms, for no soldier travels both as vanguard and rearguard, but understood in a temporal sense it is fully meaningful. Ishum both leads Era into action and makes him desist from action. The gods Era and Ishum, who initiate, prosecute, and end the war among men, both embody war. Both are warriors, Kura-Edu. Not even the king of the gods can stand in their way. He too is subordinate to war's power, but the two war gods, Era and Ishum, have different attitudes to their work. When Ishum eulogises Era's destruction, he stands in nervous awe at the destructive power of war. When Era boasts of his destruction, he revels in the brutal power of war. Ishum repeatedly demands to know how Era justifies his actions and tries to make him desist. Era has no such scruples. The different attitudes of Era and Ishum to war arise from their different functions. Era is, in Jean Bottero's words, la guerre pour la guerre. 1978-155. War waged for the sake of it, with indiscriminate slaughter. Bottero saw Ishum as Era's opposite, la guerre positive. Ishum has a conscience. He is a force for peace and acts to moderate Era's violence. As seen above, Muller's reading of the poem's introduction reveals that Ishum has the capability of starting war, but does not do so. He is only himself stirred to fight when commanded by Era to repulse the enemy and deal him destruction. He represents just war, waged in self-defense and morally justified. As we have seen, two such wars are acknowledged by the poem. The first is the bloodless campaign that brought an end to the conflict in which Era reveled, when Ishum raised Muchaishar, IV 139-150. The second is envisaged when Era charges Ishum with maintaining Babylonia's political and military power, which is to be done by waging war with an expressly positive motive, v. 27 through 39. Thus, the two war gods, Era and Ishum, are clearly distinguished by character, by function, and by method and purpose. The distinction is not confined to the poem of Era and Ishum. As Weiershauser has observed, 2010, 373, and 371, Ishum's essentially just nature is implicit in a fragmentary Old Babylonian narrative poem, which identifies his father as the sun god Shamash, who was the quintessential god of justice, and is fully explicit in an Assyrian composition which accords Ishum the epithet Ra'im Na'eti, lover of truth. The difference between Era and Ishum, between war of aggression and war in self-defense, just, explains Ishum's high status in the poem. Ishum, the prosecutor of just war, is the only power that can vanquish Era. That is why Ishum is the real hero of the poem, as Botero saw, 1978-163, Botero and Kramer, 1989-718, and why it opens with an invocation to Ishum that attaches to him such extraordinary attributes and status. Ishum alone in the universe has the capability of defeating Era. That makes him the greatest power of all. The poem's distinction between two gods of war further implies a profound idea that not all wars are equal. Warfare conducted by Era, random, unlimited, and without excuse, differs from warfare conducted by Ishum, which has a just pretext and limited aim. Ishum's victory leads us to a moral conclusion that just war is a greater force than an unjust war and morally superior to it. Differentiation between Era and Ishum thus allows for the paradox that, though war is in itself evil, on those occasions when aggression can only be ended by fighting back, it becomes a force for good. Ishum fights a just war of defense to save Babylonia, and is charged with continuing to do so in order to preserve its rightful hegemony. The poet does not make it explicit that he considers war of aggression morally inferior to war of defense, but that is certainly a response that a reader might voice. What the poet does say is that even Era is afraid of Ishum, I5, which perhaps speaks for a view that fear of just retribution resides even in the lawless. There is another ethical issue, however, on which the poem of Era and Ishum is not silent. War is evil, and yet created by the gods. How, when the gods created the world, can they allow such terrible events to occur in it? The usual explanation in ancient Mesopotamia was that the gods were angered by some human failing or sin. In this poem, only Era is angry, and his is not an anger owed to any doing of men. It is his very nature. The poem finds a different way to explain the problem. When the balance of the cosmos is upset, the normal rules of human and divine life do not apply. The unbalancing of the cosmos is expressed metaphorically on three separate occasions. First, the king of the gods, Marduk, warns Era of what happened when he, Marduk, left his position at the center of the universe at the time of the deluge. Inisabtea atbema esate same uireti uptapere. I rose from my dwelling and the seams of heaven and earth were unraveled. The same will happen again if Marduk does as Era asks. I-178. Subtea atabuma esipt ebtsapar. If I arise from my dwelling, the seams of heaven and earth will be unraveled. Then, just as the seven are unleashed and war breaks out, Ishum begs Era to give reason for his actions, and Era replies that Marduk has left his dwelling and Kabal ilyu ameli ipaprai aya. Anarakaisi isipa, the belt strap of God and man has come undone, will be difficult to refasten. The description of the war that follows is recounted in a long address of Ishum to Era, which holds Era alone responsible for the strife. Among Era's deeds is the capture of Babylon, the center of the Babylonian cosmos, in this function known as Dimkrukura, a Sumerian epithet that means bond of the lands. Bond in this epithet is a means of cosmic control. The cosmic bonds ensured order and stability in the universe and are expressed figuratively as lead ropes and mooring ropes, i.e. the means by which animals are led and rivercraft tethered. George, 1992, 260, 1-262, 1997, 170, 180, 189. The result of Era's offensive is that the cosmic bonds disintegrate. As Ishum points out, IV2, Sadim Kura'ael, Sar il Rikis, Mayetaiti Taptapar, Rikisu, you have undone the bonds of Dimkurkura, the city of the king of the gods, the bond of the lands. All three metaphors, unraveled seam, loosened belt, released rope, signify a universal absence of control, leading to chaos and the overturning of order. One consequence of cosmic disorder is negation of the civilized values by which men normally live. Implicit here is an acknowledgement of a fact fundamental to war, that it turns upside down the normal rules of human society. The worst possible sin suddenly becomes in an overturning of all moral education and ethical standards a virtue, encouraged and rewarded by those who stand in moral authority. This is a profoundly unsettling truth, and if the poet of Era and Ishum was the first to articulate it, it has surely been expressed since in other terms. John Steinbeck captures the idea in his novel East of Eden, 1952, when an old soldier, like Sherman, a veteran of the American Civil War, gives advice to his reluctant son, shortly to enlist as a cavalryman in the Indian Wars. In all of history, men have been taught that killing of men is an evil thing, not to be countenanced. Any man who kills must be destroyed, because this is a great sin, maybe the worst sin we know. And then we take a soldier and put murder in his hands and say to him, use it well, use it wisely. We put no checks on him. Go out and kill as many of a certain kind or classification of your brothers as you can, and we will reward you for it. East of Eden, Part 1, Chapter 3. When this moral inversion has occurred, it is difficult to reverse. Even the king of the gods, having once abandoned his cult center in Babylon, cannot restore equilibrium to the cosmos and regain control until Era is sated and his task done. War carries all before it and will run its course no matter what power may be opposed to it. This essay began with passages that articulate the heroic ideal of war. In the poem of Era and Ishum, the poet's characterization of Era necessarily leads him to reject that notion. The only place where heroic ideas intrude into his poem is when Era's weapons eulogize the life of the soldier. But that is exactly what one expects of objects fashioned solely to take life. The actual descriptions of Era's war in the poem are vivid and unflinching. They do not turn a blind eye to the horror, but focus on the massacre of the innocent. They are anything but heroic. The explicit purpose of the poem of Era and Ishum was to bear witness to the might of Era, so that none among gods and men may again hold him in contempt. It ends with the following words, spoken by Era himself: "Let this song exist forever, let it endure for all time, so all nations may hear it and extol my warlike deeds, so the people of the world may learn to magnify my name." If we remove the cloak of allegory, what Kabdiole Ini Marduk wants of his poem is that it open the eyes of people, everywhere and at all times, to Era as the most violent power in the world, that is, to the terrible reality of war, to what Tolstoy in the Sebastopol Sketches, 1855, called war in its most authentic expression as blood, suffering, and death. Macduff and Foote, 2006, Wadadidu. Macduff and Foote, Wada 6, Wad 92, and that it serve as a warning to not to hold Era in contempt, that is, not to go to war lightly. Speaking to the crowd in Ohio in 1880, Sherman added an injunction to the listening veterans. You can bear the warning voice to generations yet to come. This solemn duty to warn future generations of the realities war lies at the heart of the poem of Era and Ishum. The poem itself carries at its end, immediately before the three lines just quoted, a claim of apotropaic function. Those rulers, singers, scribes, and householders who honor and repeat its words will win success and fame and be kept safe from plague, Era's more routine speciality, v. 4958. This passage encouraged the use of the poem, especially Tablet 5, as an amulet to protect a household from harm. Reiner, 1960, Huska, 1974 through 357. The claim has a less tangible implication, but one that resonates more strongly outside Babylonian culture. The greater the audience for poetry that denounces war, the wider will its message spread. The vain but irrepressible hope that less war will be waged.